The World Cup is the biggest and best competition in world football, at least it is for now before Arsene Wenger ruins it by making it every 2 years. The current format of every 4 years is seen by many as perfect because the gap is long enough that each edition feels special, and it also has the benefit of allowing enough time for teams to enter different stages in their cycles. This means that a team that isn't good in one World Cup could be very good 4 years later, and likewise, the winning side in one World Cup most likely won't be as good in the next World Cup. This prevents one team from dominating and could explain why there hasn't been a consecutive winner since Brazil in 1958 and 1962. But which winning side has been the best? In this video, I want to run through each World Cup winning side and by the end rank the winners of all 21 tournaments. Don't think of this as a definitive list, but more of a fun and light-hearted way to look at the World Cup winning sides throughout history. I'm going to put a lot of emphasis on the legacy of a side, so while obviously France 2018 would demolish Uruguay 1930, Uruguay 1930 has the prestige of being the first ever winner. What I'm trying to say is don't take the ranking too seriously. Anyway, let's get started. 1930 was the very first World Cup and therefore probably the hardest to judge. The tournament was in its infancy with only 13 teams, and it's fair to say that being hosts definitely gave the Uruguayans an advantage. Supposedly before the final between Uruguay and Argentina, referee John Langenus demanded that there would be a boat ready to get him out of Montevideo the second the game was finished in case the Argentinians won. It's fair to say that in terms of technical quality, this World Cup would have been one of the weakest, but Uruguay were clear and deserving winners with extremely strong results throughout, and player of the tournament Jose Nasazzi is considered to be possibly their best ever player. It also has the legacy of being the first ever World Cup, so if not for Uruguay 1930, we may not have the World Cup as we know it. While the earliest World Cups were undoubtedly the weakest in terms of technical quality, they often have cool stories or wonderful legacies that give us a better view of them. Unfortunately, this is not the case in 1934, hosted and won by Italy, who were at the time under Benito Mussolini's fascist regime. For this reason, you wouldn't be surprised to learn that Italy were on the receiving end of some very favourable refereeing decisions, with it later being revealed that the refs were hand-picked by Mussolini himself, and interestingly, some of the other semi-finals were nations that Italy were getting along with quite well at the time. On top of this, holders Uruguay refused to travel to Europe, and Argentina only fielded an amateur team, undoubtedly making the Italians' path easier. The team did at least contain one legend in Giampiero Combi, but all of the stuff around this World Cup makes it tough to see Italy 34 in a favourable light. The final pre-war World Cup saw Italy defend their title in France, making them the first ever non-host winners. Due to the tournament not being held in Italy, it seems that there were definitely less of the tricks that helped them to win 4 years earlier, and their results were actually pretty convincing, with a win over host France and an excellent victory in the final against Hungary, who were arguably the most impressive side in the tournament. Italy's team contains Silvio Piola, who scored 5 goals in the tournament and is the all-time top scorer in Serie A, and Giuseppe Meazza, another legend of the Italian game. However, this was another tournament where the very powerful Uruguay and Argentina were absent, which notably reduced the quality of the field. The first World Cup for 12 years, and the first in South America for 20 years, the 1950 World Cup in Brazil truly was a carnival of football, but Uruguay crashed the party, winning their second World Cup in one of the most infamous games of football history. Brazil had just won the Copa America the year before and were huge favourites for the tournament and blitzed everyone they played throughout. Just look at their results. Uruguay, on the other hand, benefited from a weird format and only had to play Bolivia in the first group stage, moving on to the final group with the advantage of having much fresher legs. They then drew with Spain and squeezed past Sweden before facing Brazil in the deciding match, the Maracanazo, Brazil's greatest footballing embarrassment. Clearly, Uruguay were not the deserving winners of the 1950 World Cup, but this match, played in front of a crowd officially 173,000 but possibly as high as 210,000, is so legendary that it means Uruguay 1950 deserves a few extra points. Much like the last one, the 1954 World Cup saw an outsider defeat the tournament's standout team in the final. West Germany were massive outsiders, semi-pro and unseeded in the group stages. In fact, their first game at the tournament saw them demolished 8-3 by the team they would later face in the final, Hungary, led by Ferenc Puskás. For the rest of the tournament, the West Germans were actually quite strong, but when they met the unbeatable Hungary again in the final, they were expected to be battered. But in the game known as the Miracle of Bern, they came back from 2-0 down to win 3-2, although Puskás had a late equaliser, perhaps wrongly ruled out for offside. It should also be said that Hungary's star Puskás had missed the knockout rounds for injury and was rushed back to play in the final, although clearly was unfit, which was definitely a factor for West Germany being able to win. Interestingly though, the 1954 World Cup had by far the most goals per game at an incredible 5.4. I think it's fair to say that Brazil in 1958 were the first truly great World Cup winners. Until this point, the tournaments had weird quirks and formats, very few teams, strong nations not turning up, and so on. I mean, the last winners weren't even professional. But this all changed with 1958 Brazil, who I very briefly talked about in another video. They were extremely comfortable throughout, not conceding a goal for their first 4 games before blitzing France and then Sweden in the semi-final and final. This team featured a frankly ridiculous attack of Mario Zagallo, Vava, Garrincha, and of course a 17-year-old Pelé, who managed 7 goals in the tournament. There's going to be a lot of Brazil in this video, so I won't linger here for too long, but this was a special team who kicked off Brazil's golden era of 3 World Cups in 12 years. Brazil again. The first side to retain the Jules Rimet since before World War II, and to date the most recent. The imperious side from 4 years earlier was largely kept the same in this tournament, and they repeated the triumph, except that Pelé was injured and Garrincha stepped up and was the true star of the tournament, although Zagallo and Vava were also excellent once again. They were arguably not quite as thrilling as in 1958 and weren't overly convincing in the group stage, but in the knockouts they showed that they were still a fearsome winning machine. Definitely the least iconic of the 3 wins between 58 and 70, but this is certainly not a side to disregard. I'll be honest, being English, this is by far the hardest section to write. 1966 was obviously long before my time, and our triumph is revered to the point that it is approaching mythological status, making getting an unbiased view of the tournament quite difficult. In any case, England's win in 66 is notable for a few reasons. It was the first win for a host nation in over 30 years, and the tournament was boycotted by pretty much all of Africa for a dispute over qualification places. As for England, they certainly weren't the electric attacking juggernauts that Brazil were in their 2 wins, as at the time they were the lowest scoring World Cup winners ever, but they also had the fewest goals conceded per game at that point. The most impressive result was the semi-final win over Portugal, who were led by the legendary Eusebio, player of the tournament and top scorer. The final may have been a bit controversial, but overall, England were a strong side and deserving winners. I don't think it will come as a surprise to anyone that when I reveal the rankings at the end of these videos, Brazil 1970 is going to be very near the top. It is often considered football's best ever team, so you really don't need me telling you how good they were, but here are some of the highlights. They won every single game, something that wouldn't be repeated until 2002. Their attack was absolutely magical, scoring 19 goals in 6 games. Pelé was the only remaining member of the star front 4 from 1958, although Mario Zagallo was now the manager, making him at the time the only man to win the World Cup as a player and manager. Jairzinho was the star man this time, but the team had legends everywhere such as Pelé, Tostão, Rivellino, Gerson, Carlos Alberto and Clodoaldo. I should mention that defensively they weren't incredible, keeping just 1 clean sheet, but nonetheless 1970 Brazil was one for the ages. Hosted in West Germany, this was the 4th time a host country would win the World Cup. West Germany had a strong team containing 2 all-time greats in Franz Beckenbauer and Gerd Müller, but this was a tournament tinged with Cold War tensions because in the group stage, a struggle between brothers was played out as a country divided met on the football pitch. In a pretty sizable upset, Communist East Germany beat the capitalist West 1-0 to top the group. Unsurprisingly, this was one of the most politically charged matches of all time, and while I don't have the time to go into all the details here, it is a topic that I'd very much like to cover in a future video. Anyway, in a twist of fate, coming second in the group turned out to benefit West Germany, who ended up in a much easier second group stage than their Eastern brothers, which they breezed through. They then came up against Rinus Michel's legendary Dutch side, playing total football, led by Johan Cruyff in the final. The Dutch had dazzled all tournament long, and like Brazil 1970, Netherlands 74 is often quoted as being one of the best teams of all time. But in an upset, the Germans won 2-1 in the final with Gerd Müller scoring the winner. And while it's hard to say that they deserved to win the 74 World Cup more than the Dutch did, West Germany were a strong side and have the legacy of defeating one of football's all-time best teams. If we took the 1978 World Cup out of context and looked at it through a purely footballing lens, then this Argentina side would rank very high on the list. However, there were a lot of dodgy circumstances surrounding their win on home soil, and parallels can be drawn with Italy in 1934, also a home win. Following a coup d'etat 2 years earlier, the Argentine government was in the hands of a right-wing military junta who wanted to use the World Cup as political propaganda, and Argentina received favourable refereeing, and it is very possible that their 6-0 win over Peru in the second group stage was fixed to ensure they ended up with a better goal difference than rivals Brazil to knock them out. In the final, they beat the Netherlands, who were without the unstoppable Cruyff, as he refused to turn up in protest of the Argentine regime. In footballing terms, Argentina were undoubtedly very strong, and the man picked ahead of Diego Maradona, who was considered too young, Mario Kempes, won the Golden Boot. However, everything surrounding Argentina's win in 1978 takes a lot of the shine off it. I'll admit that I've been pretty negative on the previous 2 Italian successes in the 30s, which were politically tainted and made easier by the absences of heavyweights Uruguay and Argentina. However, Italy in 1982 are definitely not a team to view in a poor light, as this was a great team who deservedly won the tournament. Despite somewhat stumbling out of the blocks with underwhelming results in the first group stage, the second group stage saw them come through a brutally tricky group with two very impressive wins over Brazil and holders Argentina. They then eased through the semi-final before winning comprehensively in the final against West Germany, with the Germans' only goal coming when they were already 3-0 down. Paolo Rossi was the standout player with 6 goals, including a crucial brace in the semi-final and one in the final, while Marco Tardelli and Dino Zoff were also key players. This was a very convincing win for the Italians. The 1986 World Cup is often characterised as Diego Maradona single-handedly dragging a poor Argentina side to win the tournament, and while Maradona's campaign was arguably the best ever seen at a World Cup by an individual, with 5 goals and 5 assists in 7 games, the rest of the Argentina team was a lot more impressive than is commonly believed. Jorge Valdano scored an impressive 4 goals, while Jorge Barrashuga also had an outstanding tournament, including scoring the winner in the final. La Albiceleste had a formidable defence throughout, so this was very much a strong team with an outstanding star player rather than a one-man team. I'd argue that this is also one of the most iconic World Cups ever, although that is largely down to Maradona, with the goal of the century, the hand of God where a 5'5" attacker outjumped a 6-foot goalkeeper, and this photo, which is one of football's most famous, one of the all-time best celebrating in the Azteca in front of more than 100,000 people. A legendary tournament, a legendary best player, and not a bad team either. This was West Germany's final tournament before reunification, and they claimed their third World Cup to draw level with Brazil and Italy as the most frequent winners. Italia 90 has a reputation for being a very dull and defensive tournament, with the lowest ever goals per game and so much time wasting from keepers holding the ball that it prompted the introduction of the backpass law 2 years later. However, even if this was a poor tournament, West Germany won convincingly, and Franz Beckenbauer became the second man to win the World Cup as a player and manager after Mario Zagallo. They demolished their group, made it through a very tricky knockout stage before dominating in the final more than the scoreline would suggest, beating Argentina in the final in a rematch of 4 years earlier. Jürgen Klinsmann, Lothar Matthäus and Andreas Bremer were the star players in a team that probably doesn't go down as an all-time great, but were clinical and efficient and definitely the deserving winners. 94 was definitely the least thrilling and most cautious of Brazil's 5 wins, yet they were still voted as the winners of FIFA's Most Entertaining Team Award, which tells you a lot about just how brilliant their other 4 successes were. And while 11 goals in 7 games isn't outstanding, their defensive record was, with just 3 conceded in 7 games, which was a record at the time. All of their knockout games were fairly tight, and they required penalties to win in the final, the first time ever the World Cup was decided by a penalty shootout. The thrills, however, did come from Romario, fresh off a 30-goal season for Johan Cruyff's Barcelona Dream Team, who was awarded Player of the Tournament. He scored 5 goals, coming runner-up for Golden Boot behind his Dream Team strike partner, Hristo Stoichkov. Not Brazil's most free-flowing or dominant victory, but that's more about the other 4 being exceptional than 1994 being poor. I once heard France in 1998 described as a French team playing Italian football, which is understandable when you consider that in the 90s, Serie A was the world's strongest league, and 5 of France's starting 11 in the final, Zidane, Thuram, Desailly, Deschamps and Zhukov all played their club football there. But this also has a derogatory meaning, implying that France played pragmatic, defensive football, which may be partially true when you consider that their midfield 3 consisted of 3 water carriers, but the solidity that they provided allowed Zinedine Zidane and Yuri Zhukov, 2 supremely talented and exciting attacking midfielders, to sparkle in front of them. Essentially, France were pragmatic, but had 2 star attackers who they relied on for flair. They also boasted an exceptional defence featuring Lilian Thuram, Marcel Desailly and Vicente Lizarazu, and were the tournament's top scoring side, somewhat shattering the myth that they were boring and defensive. They stormed the group stage, and while the knockout stage was tighter, their 3-0 win over Brazil in the final was hugely impressive, but admittedly aided by the mystery illness of Brazil's main man and arguably world's best player at the time, Ronaldo. France was strong in 1998, but their safety-first approach keeps them from being all-time greats. After losing in the final 4 years earlier, hampered by Ronaldo's pre-match illness, he and Brazil as a whole got their redemption in 2002. Brazil featured a genuinely frightening front 3, with Ronaldo and Rivaldo, who were both Ballon d'Or winners, up top, and a young Ronaldinho, who would also get a Ballon d'Or a few years later, playing in just behind them. Ronaldo won the Golden Boot with 8 goals, Rivaldo got 5 and Ronaldinho managed 2. They were the highest scoring World Cup winners since Brazil 1970, with that strike force supplied by 2 absurdly attacking fullbacks in Cafu and Roberto Carlos. Brazil 2002 are also the only team in history to win 7 out of 7 games at a World Cup, as they flattened a fairly easy group before making their way through a tough knockout round against Denmark, England, Belgium and Germany. An overlooked part of this side is that they were also defensively formidable, conceding just 1 goal in the knockout stage and keeping 4 clean sheets overall. Yet another outstanding Brazilian side. Italy's 4th World Cup came 24 years after their last success and was somewhat unsurprisingly built on an outstanding defence with just 2 goals conceded in 7 games, the joint best ever alongside France in 1998. Centre-back Fabio Cannavaro was the captain and won the Ballon d'Or this year after leading Italy to glory, but their defence also contained Gianluca Zambrotta, Alessandro Nesta and Gianluigi Buffon in goal. They were never overly convincing throughout the tournament, a 3-0 win over Ukraine being the only time they really cut loose, and they needed penalties to win in the final against France, who were without Zidane for the shootout because, well, you all know why. Despite not being the most free-flowing winners we have seen, Italy had a great team with greats all over the place. A fun little quirk about this Italy side is that they brought a ridiculous 6 strikers to the tournament and they all scored. Francesco Totti and Luca Toni were the first choice options, both starting 6 out of 7 games, but Alessandro Del Piero, Filippo Inzaghi, Alberto Gilardino and Vincenzo Iacchinta all saw a decent amount of minutes and managed to chip in with 1 goal each. Spain in 2010 had quite possibly the best starting 11 that football has ever witnessed. I mean, just look at this team, it's a joke. Vicente Del Bosque essentially had the spine of Guardiola's Barcelona minus Messi, but with the addition of other brilliant players such as Iker Casillas, Xabi Alonso and Sergio Ramos. But unlike Barcelona, Spain were often accused of being dull and impotent going forward, a problem caused by Del Bosque's need to pick his team politically to avoid upsetting Real Madrid. The inclusion of Xabi Alonso in midfield meant that instead of Barcelona's 4-3-3, Spain had to play a 4-2-3-1 with a double pivot of Alonso and Busquets, with Xavi pushed up into an unfamiliar number 10 role and Iniesta drifting in from the left wing, creating a sort of off-centre midfield diamond. I won't go too in depth on this now, as Spain's tactic in this period from 2008 to 2012 is something I want to make a whole video on in future, but essentially the inclusion of Alonso threw off the usual passing combinations of the Barcelona midfield, making them not so incisive going forward. But that's enough negativity. While Spain won every single knockout game just 1-0, I personally find them brilliant to watch rather than dull. They weren't defensive, snatching goals on the break, but rather masters of keeping games under total control by suffocating the opposition with virtually unstoppable possession. They deserved to win every game they played, they just never simply needed to score more than 1 goal. The best example of this was in the semi-final where they beat a wonderfully exciting Germany side 1-0, who were probably the second best team at the tournament, and any team containing Xavi and Iniesta, in my opinion, could never be considered boring. Finally, the legacy of this Spain side is simply immense, as the tiki-taka style became what virtually all top clubs in Europe strive for the entire next decade, and Spain and Barcelona were always the blueprint, but they were never eclipsed. After winning Italia 90 and Euro 96, Germany entered a trophy drought which would last 18 years, although in that time they reached an incredible 5 semi-finals of World Cups and Euros without a single triumph. In 2010, they had reinvented themselves as a truly exciting, attacking and pressing side, but lost to Spain in the semis, but now in 2014 they had developed into a more mature side, but were still brilliant to watch and a well-oiled winning machine to claim their first World Cup since reunification. They were clearly the deserving winners. The other finalists, Argentina, were pretty unconvincing throughout and were dragged to the final by Lionel Messi, but they best demonstrated their credentials by bulldozing the hosts and pre-tournament favourites Brazil 7-1 in the semi-final in one of the most remarkable matches in a lot of people's living memory. The game was Brazil's worst embarrassment since the Maracanazo in 1950 and became known as the Mineirazo, and that alone gives this German side an outstanding legacy. Outside of the 7-1, they scored an outstanding 18 goals in the tournament and didn't really have a standout player as the whole team was just brilliant. In my opinion, Toni Kroos was probably the 3rd best player at the tournament after James Rodriguez and Arjen Robben, but Philipp Lahm, Thomas Müller, Bastian Schweinsteiger and Manuel Neuer weren't far behind. Still fresh in the memory, France's 2018 World Cup squad was undoubtedly brilliant with a frankly absurd amount of depth. Their star players in the tournament were Antoine Griezmann, Raphael Varane, Kylian Mbappe, Paul Pogba and N'Golo Kante. I mean, clearly very few previous World Cup winners could compete with France's sheer quality on paper. But this France team won't go down as an all-time great winner because of manager Didier Deschamps' insistence on being pragmatic, leading to France being quite dull to watch. They stumbled through the group stage, although admittedly they did improve as the tournament progressed. Both fullbacks were naturally centre-backs, so they didn't get forward much, while Blaise Matuidi, normally a deeper midfielder, was used on the left wing to provide balance for Mbappe on the other wing, who was the only real source of excitement. They were the deserving winners, however, and their win over Belgium in the semi-final, who were the only other truly strong team, was impressive, but they also benefited from other heavyweights Brazil, Germany, Argentina and Spain all being in transitional decline, Italy and the Netherlands not even qualifying, and while their opponent in the final, Croatia, were undoubtedly strong, they're not quite in the very top bracket of international football. France were a great team, but perhaps not as good as they could have been, and a weaker set of nations for the tournament than usual. So, that's now every World Cup covered. Over 90 years of history, 21 tournaments, a lot of exceptional teams. And it's now time for me to reveal my rankings, but again, remember that this is just a bit of fun and don't take this too seriously. But in my opinion, there is a clear bottom 5, a clear top 5, and then 11 in the middle that was strong but not legendary. Let's start with the bottom 5. These were the tournaments that were politically tainted, undeserving winners, or simply of poor quality, and they are Italy 34, West Germany 54, Italy 38, Uruguay 1950 and Argentina 78. From this point onwards, I would describe every other winner as good. From places 16 to 9 are teams that were strong but not quite in the top bracket, and they are West Germany 74, Italy 06, Uruguay 1930, France 2018, England 66, Brazil 94, France 98 and West Germany 1990. And now I've got 3 more who I would describe as brilliant teams but just below the legendary status. And these 3 are Italy 82, Brazil 62, Argentina 86. But finally, the top 5, these are the all-time greats. 5th, Brazil in 1958. 4th, Germany 2014. 3rd, Brazil 2002. 2nd, Spain in 2010. But number 1, I mean, how could it be anyone else? Has to be Brazil 1970. There's nothing left to be said of this team, as they are so revered that I couldn't possibly add anything new to the conversation. But in my opinion, the greatest World Cup winning side, possibly the greatest ever football team, is Brazil in 1970. A huge thanks to everyone who watched this video. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and also follow me on Twitter. It would mean a lot to me. I'm really enjoying making content for this channel, and in researching this video, I found some really interesting stuff which definitely deserve videos of their own, so I've got lots of new content in the pipeline. So thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.